Say hello, everyone, as people start to trickle in. We're just waiting for a few more people to show up and then we'll fully kick it off. But we started a little early, let people join, get settled. Hello to everyone coming in right now. Hope everyone's having a nice week. We're just going to allow again for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes for people to file in and then we'll officially kick it off. But we appreciate everybody joining. Hope everyone has a long weekend. I'm looking forward to it. Okay, I think we can get things started. Why not? 11:01. But hi, thank you again, everyone, for joining. We really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day. But just want to let you know the session's being recorded and will be shared afterwards. So if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A during the presentation. But we also will review a few questions at the end. But for today, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers, Kristen Harmeling and Emlyn Gustafson. For her career, Kristen has been helping brands understand the attitudes, behaviors, and aspirations of younger generations, specializing in financial services, technology, and education. Combining qualitative and quantitative approaches, she explores how evolving brands, behaviors, and digital experiences influence the way people live, spend, save, and connect. Kristen joined Buzzback in the fall of 2023 after spending time at WB Communications, a global PR and marketing agency, and YouGov, where she led the survey of affluence and wealth and the youth, family, and education sector. Emlyn is a research analyst at Buzzback with experience across quantitative and qualitative research. Throughout her career, she has contributed to projects spanning youth entertainment, technology, and streaming services, helping brands better understand the people they serve. She earned her MBA from Quinnipiac University in 2025 and brings a well-rounded perspective to consumer insights. Kristen, Emily, thank you so much for being here today, and please take it away.
Thanks so much, Autumn. And again, as Autumn said, thank you very much for joining us today for our third webinar in our Gen Z webinar series. Okay, so what we'll talk about today, we'll talk about the research we did and a little bit about Buzzback, and then we're going to get right into the heart of it and talk about the trends and the insights and the findings that we saw across several different studies that Buzzback sponsored about Gen Z, money, and finances. And then we're going to wrap with a few takeaways, the things to remember most about the learnings of Gen Z, and then importantly, how brands can be part of the solution. So jumping right in, who did we talk to? Well, you see in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, this is the same core survey that both of our initial webinars on Gen Z were developed from. So we did a survey of 4,800 Gen Z and millennials, evenly split across the generations and the markets being the UK and the US, and it was fielded in just late March of 2026. We surveyed people from age 14 up to 45, and today we'll be showing what we can of the 14 to 18-year-old market, and then both other cohorts of Gen Z, 19 to 22 and 23 to 29. And we'll also oftentimes share the younger cohort of millennials to give context to the generation to really help us understand where Gen Z delivers or makes is different from millennials and where they aren't. What you won't see in this presentation is a lot of specific data breakouts between the US and the UK. That is because these trends are, generally speaking, in lockstep with each other. There is far more that binds the cohort together across the ocean, the pond, if you will, than life stage within the generation. So in other words, the very youngest Gen Z in the US and the UK look quite similar, as do those emerging young adults across the markets, as do those that are in the workforce. There's another source that I'll be pulling some information from today, and it's from a separate survey that Buzzback did among finance and tech in the US and UK. And there too, we focus on millennials and Gen Z, but our Gen Z starts at 18 for that study. So you'll see everything well labeled. I just wanted to set the stage and do my due diligence as a researcher and let you all know where this data and information is coming from. For both studies that we've used to build today's webinar, we really infuse the research with what we call our blended research approach here at Buzzback. And what that means is that we incorporate both qualitative and quantitative techniques into our what would be a traditional quantitative study to ensure that we get as deep an audience understanding as possible. So whether that means ensuring that we have some deep dive elements, like going deeper to understand values and attitudes, or whether it means we're giving people an opportunity to express themselves visually. And we generally do that through eCollage, which is a proprietary program or methodology that Buzzback developed that Emmeline will talk a little bit more, where people can make collages, literal collages with imagery from inside of a quant survey. To whether we do things in context, and that might mean recreating apps, recreating website experiences, so people aren't just answering questions about flat stimuli, but also to incorporating social and digital analytics. And we'll talk a bit about influencers and some trends that were revealed through social and digital analytics within this webinar. So the important thing is that we take a 360-degree look at consumers as human beings. So it's not just demographics, it's not just segments, it's people. And with every study that we do, we try to ensure that we've got something in that study to reveal people's identity, their motivations, their values, their aspirations, and then of course their behaviors and what their emotional needs are. And again, we're going to double click into the emotional aspect pretty deeply in today's webinar. So let's jump in. So in the first two webinars we hosted on Gen Z, we established the fact that this is a stressed out generation. I myself am the mom of 3 Gen Zers. And, when I saw the data, I was even surprised. I'm like, oh my gosh, we read the headlines. I feel like I live it every day on behalf of my kids and their friends. But this is the real deal. This generation is more stressed than generations today and more stressed than people their age were in former generations. So with overwhelm as the emotional backdrop, where we focus on mental well-being, even in our first 2 webinars, money becomes one of wellness's most visible expressions. So financial anxiety, it's not just being driven by how much money is or is not in someone's wallet or bank account, but it's being driven by the cultural environment around them. It's being driven by the stories they hear, the examples they see in their lives, and the uncertainty that they perceive. So financial pressure shows up across every life stage of Gen Z. And so here on this slide, we're starting with the very youngest, 14 to 18-year-olds, and we're going up to what we're calling the working Gen Z, ages 23 to 29. And when we ask people what makes the biggest impact on your day-to-day well-being, School and mental health are absolutely the clear top pressures for 14 to 18-year-olds, but money is right there at 42% saying it's one of the top pressures or top things that impact their daily life. When we get to the early adult, maybe they're in college, maybe they're in trade school, maybe they've already embarked on their career or in the military, emotional strain and money pressure, generally in the form of cost of living pressures, start to compete with each other. When we get into the post-education or post-job training stage of Gen Z's lives, financial stress becomes a shared well-being story, and you can't even separate it. We've got three things right up there in the top, biggest impact on their lives: money, financial situation, cost of living, mental health, and then you see a really marked drop, 14-point drop to future uncertainty and feeling left behind. And if we think about how intertwined, of course, money and financial situation is and the cost of living, if I combine those two things, it actually becomes the most common element that makes an impact on day-to-day well-being across all of these groups. And importantly, these concerns are not limited to what's impacting their day-to-day well-being. Well, it's also impacting how they feel about the future. So what we're seeing today is that financial pressure extends beyond day-to-day experiences. Gen Z is worried about affording the life they want. They're worried about being able to save for their future. And the last one, concerned about credit score, that's a today concern as well as a tomorrow concern. I promise I won't overwhelm anybody with anecdotes, but we have a group family chat going on with about 8 of us. And my two 23-year-olds were arguing and battling and showing off with pride how much their credit scores have gone up in the past few weeks. Very proud of them both. I'll take the up 15 points more than the up 3 points. But when I think back to when I was 23, credit score was not something that was on my mind. So the uncertainty that they're facing has real consequences for how young people today are thinking about major life milestones. And for many Gen Z, the traditional path to adulthood feels increasingly difficult to reach. These are things that we live with every day. Every one of us do. But if we're not in family formation, in household formation, if we don't have those as our immediate expected next steps, I think it's hitting us a little bit differently. We all know that housing costs has risen, but what we haven't experienced, many of us, is that same level of debt that people that in the Gen Z generation are carrying with them. Debt largely from the education that they've invested in, but also debt from rising costs, whether it's credit card debt that they're having difficulty paying off. And I think we all know the census trends that are continuing, that people are getting married later in life, people are having children at later times in their life. What I think is interesting about this generation, and maybe what compounds this issue, or quite honestly, maybe it makes these issues easier to deal with and accept, is that Gen Z has already experienced disrupted milestones throughout their formative years. Emmeline, I'd love if you jump in a little bit and talk about some of the disruptions the Gen Z has faced.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here, Kristen, as someone who has experienced these interrupted milestones herself. From canceled proms to virtual schooling and graduations, all future milestones for Gen Z, like renting a place of our own or even getting married, feel much more out of reach and harder to achieve. And this really does tie into feeling a lack of financial stability to be able to experience these moments in the future.
Thank you. I think it's easy for some of us to forget what COVID was like if you were in high school or if you were in college. And we're talking about millions and millions of students. And COVID for many of us has been put behind us. But if you didn't experience that form of your life, if you're not in your 20s, maybe even early 30s, and if you didn't have people of that age around you, it's really easy to kind of think about, oh, the COVID hangover is the argument about return to work. And that's really not the case at all for young people, like Emmeline described. Millions upon millions not getting the graduation, millions not getting the prom, millions starting off college in a virtual world and then coming home, because what was the point of being in a dorm room if you were taking all your classes online? So we have a couple of quotes, and I'd love, Emmeline, if you brought these quotes to life for us a little bit.
Yeah, we have some examples here from fellow Gen Zers who feel this weight and pressure on them and express uncertainty towards what the future looks like. So, using our eCollage tool, people were able to create a mural out of a selection of hundreds of images to help express how they feel towards their well-being, as well as give it a title and description reflecting what pictures they chose. And we encourage participants to really take their time with the exercise to capture how they truly felt. So what you see here is our first collage, and the sentiment it shares is really indicative of a lot of the responses we saw. This young woman from the UK titled her collage, The Life of a Young Person in 2026, and her description reads, "These images reflect my feelings about daily life and the future. I feel as though I am drowning sometimes, with lots of overwhelm about my financial stability in this economy. I wish I could just close down everything, even just for a day, to not have to think so much about it." And on this slide here, participants were also able to write on their collages, as seen in this very expressive response here. I'm sure we can all use our imagination to figure out what we censored here, but wow, this young gentleman couldn't even title his collage with all the emotions he was feeling. So, from student loan worries to doubts of ever owning a home, he really captures the stresses that burden Gen Z. And just like the last collage as well, this desire for a pause or just a break in the action is once again iterated, as well as this idea of not knowing what next steps to take. And while these are just two collages we are sharing, I feel it's important to note that what these express were not outliers in the plentiful responses we saw.
Okay, thank you so much. So this is not just about, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to buy a house in the future? Will I ever be able to buy an engagement ring, give an engagement ring, get a engagement ring, and have a wedding? Because feeling behind financially is often experienced about judgment about who they are, not just what they have. So this is more than economic stress. It's a threat to young people's sense of worth, belonging, and belief in their future potential. This is all hitting at a moment in time where people are truly growing into who they will be as adults. So what makes this particularly difficult is that financial comparisons happen without context. For my generation, I remember so well when leasing a car became a thing. And we used to talk about, well, don't be fooled. Someone might be driving an amazing car, but have nothing to back it up in the bank account because it might be on a lease. And so all of those signals that we used to be able to trust when we were trying to judge someone's financial status in the world, they no longer apply. So Gen Z sees the outcomes of how people are spending their money, but they don't see if they really have resources behind them. So as a result, many Gen Z, and quite frankly, the rest of us as well, are comparing our everyday realities to the most visible successes of others. And that's why feeling behind financially isn't just about money, it's about identity, belonging, and confidence in the future. And when we really think about the fact that about 50% across the UK and the US of Gen Z say that they feel behind financially compared to others their age, that's just like wild. I mean, basically, what many of them are saying is, I feel behind financially before I've even started. And this sentiment, while our base sizes are small, when we try to parse apart the teenagers from the young 20 somethings, it is still relevant among even 4 of 10 teenagers. But the sentiment does peak at about that college age or when you're out of high school and you're trying to figure out what to do with your future. So it's very, very easy to sort of think that, okay, well, if they're this worried about money, it must mean they're not spending. And that is just simply not the case. It's easy to assume this. It's easy to assume that they're pulling back from spending because of all the stress and anxiety, not just about finances and the future, but that's not what we're seeing. Nearly half feel like they're doing a pretty good job at being responsible in their spending, and they tell us that they do a good job separating what they need from what they want. At the same time, we've got about 50% saying, I buy what I want when I want it. So at first, these findings might seem contradictory, and that's actually a red thread that you'll see throughout this presentation, that findings do feel contradictory, but yet both things are held true at the same time. So they're not trying to eliminate spending. They're trying to spend intentionally. They're making very intentional trade-offs. Some may skip purchasing entirely. Some may buy secondhand, wait for sales, cut back in one area so they can spend more meaningfully in another area. So financial caution has not replaced consumption. It's changed how consumption is justified. And I think it's helpful to just take a very quick step back to remember the environment that today's Gen Z grew up in. So in the late teens, there was relatively stable spending. We didn't see a lot of increased spending from 2020, 10 up through the COVID years, relatively stable. Fashion had already been digital for quite some time. The thrifting movement was already starting to happen. Purchasing through a eco sustainability or eco responsibility lens was also happening, and also hearing about things and purchasing via social media influencers and what they were promoting. Those were already starting to happen. COVID hit, an abrupt shift for all of us. We changed our purchasing because we weren't going anywhere. So it was all about what could be bought, worn, played, or shared from home. 2022 through today, spending has actually recovered, but it looks very, very different. It's clearly more omnichannel. It is more value seeking. Gen Z is mixing increasingly new items with used items and high end and budget items. So what we're seeing is that Gen Z is reserving full price and higher end splurging for items that are either visible, relevant to their own identity, either in a visible or a very quiet personal way, or that they're emotionally rewarding. So the key point again is that spending has not disappeared, it's simply become more intentional. One of the most interesting things that we're seeing, and these are some trends that were born from some of our desktop research, then followed up with on our social and media digital analytics capability, was self-restraint in and of itself is becoming a form of self-expression. Gen Z is not embarrassed to say, no, I don't have the money for that right now, or no, I can't do that because I'm saving for this. So trends like loud budgeting, thrifting, and de-influencing aren't about deprivation, they're about control. So what does loud budget do? Loud budgeting declares your boundaries. And Gen Z grew up talking about things like mental health, boundaries. So this is something that feels very natural to them. I'm just going to say no, not in my budget for this month. They're unapologetic about their financial priorities. When we think about de-influencing, this isn't about Gen Z rejecting influencers. This is about Gen Z following influencers who are actively pushing back on pressure to buy by calling out things that might be overhyped, that they generally don't consider worth it. And thrifting has absolutely hit mainstream, and it's about choosing to spend differently and also being able to infuse some of that eco responsibility that they value so much into their purchasing and have that reflected in their style. And what's notable about these behaviors is that, as I mentioned, they are not anti-consumption, they're signals of identity, which helps explain why Gen Z can simultaneously embrace things like thrifting and fast fashion and luxury spending. And I'm going to kick it over to Emmeline to talk about some of these.
Yeah, for sure. Gen Z spends their money very intentionally, and we do this as a form of self-expression. We thrift to demonstrate our commitment to eco-responsibility, as well as finding items in apparel that are unique and we feel represents ourselves and who we want to be. While staying environmentally cautious, thrifting also allows us to express originality and know we own something that's potentially one of a kind. We turn to fast fashion to hop on the latest trends. We want our peers to kind of know that we're up to date with what's current, and these brands provide the quickest and most affordable route to being able to express ourselves. And if the trend that we participated in fades or it didn't really suit how we want to express ourselves, these purchases feel less costly when we're ready to jump ship to whatever is trending next. And of course, last but not least, luxury purchases. These are the more intermittent buys that Gen Z makes, but the ones that often feel most important to us. We splurge an item here and there, but with intention of these purchases being ones that we use long term and also provide a sense of self-gratification. These are the same ones that signal your social status, but even for luxury purchases like fragrances that aren't necessarily tangible or can be seen by our peers, knowing we're wearing an expensive scent kind of makes us feel like we've done something good for ourselves. And the common thread is identity fit. Gen Z is still buying, but purchasing must signal taste, values, and/or social context. And on this slide here, we have some brands that don't necessarily fall into just one of those spending categories, but represent qualities for perhaps two or even all three. So just to name a couple here. Urban Outfitters, they combine the idea of thrifting and fast fashion as they use recycled materials in a lot of their apparel, but they also keep up with current trends when releasing new items like the fast fashion leaders. And then I love Poppy as an example of a brand that delivers to their consumers in new ways because while it may be viewed by some as just another beverage that's on the market, the fact that it's a healthier alternative to soda, it makes people feel good about themselves so that they consume something better for them than what's traditionally available in the market.
Okay, great. So up to this point, we've been talking a lot about financial pressure. But one of the most interesting findings is that pressure does not eliminate optimism or hope. Gen Z is not sitting in a purely negative emotional state. They're carrying two things at once. They're carrying stress about money, uncertainty about the future. They're carrying this alongside hope, ambition, and a belief that things can improve. And that's really important because it changes how brands should communicate. If we only acknowledge the pressure, we risk coming across as quite pessimistic. But if we only talk about the opportunity, we risk making ourselves feel disconnected from reality and tone deaf and just not aware of the optics. So the most effective brands recognize both of those sentiments. So in the study that we did about finance and technology, we took a little bit of an experiment and we put 80 different emotions in front of people in the survey, and we asked them to select as many as they want to about their current state of personal finances. And what you see on the left-hand side is a word cloud of the top 20 emotions shown. And then we took a look at how many people only cited a positive emotion, only cited a negative emotion, and then cited both. And you can clearly see here that the overwhelming situation is that people are holding both positive and negative emotions at the same time. So this is not about emotions being polarized, where there's one group of Gen Z who's happy and one group of Gen Z that's negative. The majority of Gen Z are holding internally both positive and negative emotions about their personal finances. And I think this quote really captures the reality better than any chart or data could. And it says, sometimes I feel free, that's a positive. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed, negative, and lost with the decisions I make in life. And other times I feel on track with my goals and money moves. Financial well-being is not a fixed state. It's a constant balancing act that Gen Z plays every day between confidence and uncertainty. So before I show you some of the data behind the word cloud that was on the slide before the quote slide, I'd like to share what we do with all of the individual emotions. I mentioned that there were 80 emotions that people could select from, and these bucket up into 10 what we're calling emotion families. Emotion families can be plotted on a 2x2 grid. You can see the horizontal grid is a reflection of pleasantness. Is something a low pleasant emotion or a high pleasant emotion? The easiest two there are happiness and sadness. And then the energy on the vertical axis talks about how much true energy or intensity there is behind an emotion. If you're familiar at all, if you've been in the education space or you've used one of the many models that have been adapted by Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence Mood Meter, this is what inspired us to create this context as well. So what's important is that emotions don't just tell us how people feel, they also tell us what they may be ready to do next. And this is where understanding the emotions people hold inside, understanding people's individual emotional signature, if you will, comes particularly important. So let's take a quick look at some of the data. One extra click. And you can see that there is some shading on here, and the shading directly links back to the different shades of the emotion families that you saw on the previous stage. So for younger Gen Z, we see more fear and more shame-based emotions. So not only do we see worried, stressed, and self-conscious, but if you look on the bottom of this chart, we also see words like resentful, confused, annoyed, and vulnerable. Those are all highest for the youngest Gen Z, and then they diminish slightly in commonality between the older Gen Z and younger millennials. So while negative emotions do not go away, the intensity of the negativity does wane as Gen Z grows older. So the emotions are about protection for younger Gen Z. Am I going to be okay? For older Gen Z, the emotions and the negative emotions, as I mentioned, are still present, but we start to see more openness. Like we see this word interested rise to the top for 23 to 29-year-olds. And we see the word focused rise to the top, relative top for the younger millennials. So things are definitely shifting and changing with each different cohort within Gen Z. So to sum up the insights that are born from that data, what we really see here is that we can see a progression from what we're calling restless optimism. Emotions are feeling intense, they're feeling inconsequential. Optimism feels really fragile and conditional, and energy is driven by tension. When we move into the older Gen Z, 23 to 29-year-olds, we're seeing it as exploratory optimism. The energy shifts from tension to engagement, and optimism becomes increasingly grounded because older Gen Z, they're starting to figure it out and they're not emotionally reacting to the same degree as the younger Gen Z. Then what is the end goal? Hopefully even better than the younger millennials are experiencing. It's confident optimism. Energy becomes more directed, optimism looks more secure, and they've acclimated to this idea that they're always going to have a duality of emotions in play. I want to flip back to the previous slide really quickly and just spend a moment on the younger millennials, because we do see this word frustrated come into play for the younger millennials, despite the fact that they're feeling more capable, more focused, and even safe. I'm going to say that frustration is almost directly anchored in today's housing market. It is astounding that the average age of a first-time home buyer has now reached 40. So many in this younger millennial group, they feel like they're starting to figure it all out, but yet home ownership still feels unattainable, which is absolutely causing a sense of frustration. So this is where the emotion story really becomes actionable for marketers. Different emotions create different needs and different motivations. So fear-based emotions like worry and anxiety make people want protection, certainty, and reassurance. Shame-based emotions, like we saw with the youngest of the Gen Z, feeling very self-conscious, make people want to not be judged. I'm not going to put myself in a situation where I'm going to feel judged by you. And instead, I want to be in a situation where I feel understood. Openness-based emotions like exploration or interest or curiosity create a readiness to learn and engaged. Whereas when you start to feel a little bit secure, you want messaging and marketers and brands to talk to you and reinforce those feelings of safety, being focused, and being capable to help create a sentiment of readiness to act and continue to move forward. So up to this point, we've talked a lot about pressure, uncertainty, and just wrapped up talking about the emotional complexity that Gen Z is holding inside of them when it comes to their finances. It's so important to know that even for the youngest generation, this is not a story about resignation. Gen Z is very aware of what's happening around them. They know the housing market is expensive. They know that financial milestones and life stage milestones are taking longer to achieve. They know the rules have changed. So what stood out to us is that this awareness, again, even for the youngest Gen Z, does not lead to disengagement. All of Gen Z are actively looking for ways to make progress. They're looking for reinsurance. Most importantly, they're looking for partners to help them make that next tangible step. One thing we saw consistently across the cohorts within Gen Z and admittedly millennials as well is that financial decisions are not made from a single source. So Gen Z pieces a lot of different sources of information together, many of whom they are proactively seeking out. And some of the old standbys, like friends and family, the old classic word of mouth, are absolutely still the number one way that Gen Z is learning about money. But what are they also doing? They're getting information from online digital advertising. They're getting information from search, which is not necessarily AI powered. We'll be talking about AI in a more depth in a later webinar. But they are getting some recommendations. They're looking at reviews. And we're also going to double click in this webinar on the notion of creators or influencers, which 31% of Gen Z, double the amount of millennials, are looking to for insight into finances. So if we advance to the next slide, because financial decisions feel so personal and consequential, confidence comes from seeing the same things reinforced from different directions or through different lenses. This is why creators and influencers become so important. Because when they make financial decisions or they want to understand what the best course of action is, they're not just looking for information. It's not just an information or I don't know what to do problem. It's a confidence problem. So they're not really asking someone, what should I do next? They're asking someone, am I making the right decision? Expertise alone is not enough because validation matters, independent verification matters, and seeing other people make similar choices matter. So the most effective brands understand that confidence is built through reassurance and not just education. And Evelyn, if you could share a little bit about what it's like to kind of live in this creator and influencer world, particularly as it relates to wanting some validation and reassurance about financial situations.
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about Gen Zers looking for social validation from creators and influencers, we aren't looking for our generation's version of Dave Ramsey or your traditional financial experts. Gen Z consumes content that comes from relatable people and realistic situations that they can compare their own financial standing and habits to others like themselves. So on this slide here, on the left, we have a couple of influencers who talk about finances online, but not ones that Gen Z looks to model their own financial situation off of. So Becca Bloom, for example, she's well followed by Gen Z, but what she posts are lavish shopping hauls, unboxings of luxury items, and clips showing off her luxurious lifestyle. So these videos are not relatable to the average Gen Zer, but they find it fun and outrageous to put themselves in her shoes as someone who at least appears to have no financial hardships. And Caleb Hammer as well, on the other hand, he showcases people who are in serious debt or have made extremely poor financial choices. So he also has a large Gen Z following, but this generation watches his content for both entertainment value and the relief that comes from being able to say, thank goodness that's not me. Who Gen Z does watch online that shapes their thoughts towards finances are relatable influencers like the three examples on the right here. They talk about how much they spent in a week, how they budget their paycheck, or even de-influencing others from buying items they regret spending their money on. And Gen Z, as Kristen mentioned before, is very open and willing to talk about finances, which may have been seen as a little taboo by other generations. And watching influencers of their own age who are navigating similar realities allows Gen Z to feel validated in their own situations and helps them understand they are not alone in the financial stage they're in. These influencers are transparent about trade-offs, they share mistakes along with wins, and they show how decisions actually play out in everyday life. What Gen Z often wants isn't expertise at distance, it's proof that someone like them is also figuring it out. At the end of the day, relatability creates trust, and trust creates confidence. And yet, despite all this online searching for financial answers and validation, much of Gen Z still feels stuck. Nearly half or more say they haven't found the right tools, resources, or companies to help them achieve their financial goals. Speaking from experience, for young people, life steps are initially largely linear. You go to school, you get the grades you need to continue forth, and it's always told you what the next step is you need to progress. But the transition from schooling to how to land a first job doesn't really have those clear steps. The goals are there, and we know where we want to end up, but we don't know the how to get there. And this finding really jumped out to us. I feel like Gen Z commonly hears that we're kind of lazy and our efforts aren't the same as older generations, but Gen Z isn't disengaged and they aren't ignoring the issue at hand. They're actively looking, researching, comparing, and asking questions, but many still don't feel like they found a practical path forward. So the goals are clear: save more, build financial stability, feel more in control. What's often missing is a tangible and clear next step, and that's where brands have an opportunity to shine.
Thank you so much, Emily. I could not have said that with the same level of command and authenticity. So we really, really appreciate you and what you're bringing to the table in this webinar. So before we get into what this all means from brands, I thought it would be helpful to reinforce just the key things to remember about Gen Z and money. Financial anxiety is real, but so is optimism. Spending hasn't stopped, it's become more intentional. Money is emotional, not just financial. Confidence is built through reassurance, not necessarily traditional expertise. And the emotional journey changes across life stages within Gen Z. So with that, let's talk about what all this means for brands. So the title of this webinar was From Anxiety to Agency, and this is the central idea that emerged from the research when we were doing our analysis. Gen Z does not expect brands to solve their financial problems. They don't expect a budgeting app to fix the housing market or a bank to eliminate economic uncertainty. But what they do expect is something much more realistic and, I would say, more important. They expect brands to help progress feel possible. So earlier we saw that emotional reality that life feels overwhelming, the financially reality of I have no idea what the future will bring. And as Emmeline just shared, I'm not even sure sometimes what the next step is to help me reach the goal that I am pretty convinced is the goal that I want for my life. That personal reality of I'm not where I should be and I'm feeling like I'm falling behind, whether or not that's true. And then the expectation for the brand to help me make progress. And here's where it gets really important for brands without adding to my load. When we asked what makes a finance brand worthwhile to do business with, we learned that the best partners help Gen Z save money and reduce effort. These are surprisingly practical numbers. The number one response was not anything about inspiration, it wasn't status, it was help me save money and make my life easier. And it's so important because it reminds us that emotional support starts with functional support. Because before a brand can inspire confidence, it has to reduce friction. Before it can become a trusted partner, it has to be useful. And this is particularly important for younger Gen Z. And across the board, whether we're talking younger, older, UK, or the US, the message is really quite consistent. Help save me money, help save me time, help me reduce my effort, and make life feel a little bit more manageable. We also asked a question in the finance and tech survey that we did, again, in both the UK and the US. So we asked an open-ended question. Well, actually, first we asked people to rate brands. And I'm not going to focus on the brands because what they think about an individual brand isn't what we want to talk about here. We want to talk about overall what characterized those brands that Gen Z told us they felt were on the way up and which they felt were on the way down. And some clear themes emerged. Brands that are viewed as being on the way up, convenient, frictionless, provides tangible values, is seen and heard, there's validation, is kind of crowdsourced. When a brand is seen as on its way down, it means confidence has eroded, the tangible value is questioned, or somebody becomes a new entrant to the marketplace and I can replace what you're doing because it's not quite meeting up to my standards. So because we're running short on time, I'm going to take us home. And what should brands do to support your well-being? Have to be honest, have to make life easier, have to support without pressure, and you have to offer me tools and resources. So the brands that will be invited into Gen Z's world won't promise transformation. They're not going to solve the housing crisis. They're not going to solve the level of uncertainty in the markets, but they will make progress feel possible. This starts with reducing cognitive overload or at a bare minimum, not adding to it. It then goes on to guiding without judgment, making sure that we're promoting feelings of capability and confidence. It means validating progress, even little milestones that are hit along the way, And all of this will help Gen Z move from anxiety to agency. And I think we have a time for just a couple of questions.
Yes, we do. Thank you guys so much. This was really great. And as an older member of Gen Z or Gen Z working group, I can say you guys really hit the nail on the head with some of those things in there. No, but it really resonated as a member of this. So thank you guys so much. But with that being said, we do have a few questions that were set ahead of time during registration. We're going to dive into those right now. So the first one being, as a Gen Z, how do I know that I'm not falling behind on financial growth?
Well, that one sounds like it's for you, Emily.
Yeah, for sure. I have a love-hate relationship with this question because transparently, it's what I ask myself probably every day. And my answer for this is that our generation largely doesn't know if we're falling behind financially. And this is why we seek out peers and people online in similar spots to kind of compare and contrast ourselves to see if we're on track with others. And we look and grab onto things to validate where we're at, and we hope that we find others in comparable situations to reassure ourselves. And this question just really represents why Gen Z wants financial tools and guidance from brands, because we just want to know that we're doing okay.
Awesome, thanks.
I can second that too. I am falling into the TikTok influencer trap of please help me. But yeah, no, I couldn't agree with that more. And then we'll dive into the next one because I know we're running up on time. So the next question is, does Gen Z have a markedly different attitude about higher education as it relates to money and future prospects?
Yeah, there's absolutely no question that they are rethinking what it means to advance your education and move into the job market. This is about cost, debt, employability. They have not rejected higher education. This is true in the UK as well as the US, but they increasingly want proof it pays off. Emmeline talked a little bit about like the linear nature of being a teenager and making decisions. It used to be a given. Okay, college is the goal, and the backup goal is trade school or military. That is not the case anymore at all. Everything is being considered simultaneously with an eye towards what's the return on my investment going to be. And it's not just about money, it's also because, again, I'm going to go back to COVID. COVID didn't just shine a light on student debt. COVID basically blew up the entire college experience. Across the nation, freshmen were sitting in their dorms taking online classes instead of being on campus. And after the first year of COVID, we saw a massive amount of college-age students come back home and come back home. And 2 years later, after COVID, some national statistics show us in the US how community college enrollment really spiked. And again, it wasn't just because of the money, it was about this rethinking of what the entire four-year college experience is supposed to look like. So now we see the college community responding in creative ways. Like there are many national colleges and universities, it's not mainstream yet, thinking about or starting to offer four-year bachelor's degrees, what we used to know as a four-year degree, in 3 years to respect the changing needs and expectations of Gen Z and their family. So that's a little bit of the take to respond to that question. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us this morning. I hope you can see that all of us on the call are quite passionate about this topic, and we really welcome individual conversations. If you sent in a question either during or beforehand and it wasn't addressed, we will absolutely be following up with each and every one of you on an individual basis. And again, we're very, very grateful for your time and hope you have a great day.
Thank you guys so much.